Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this virtual meeting of the Midwestern Legislative Conference Midwest Canada Trade Subcommittee, focusing on the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA. My name is Eileen Grossman. I'm with CSG Midwest, and I serve as the staff liaison to the Midwest Canada Relations Committee and its Trade and Energy subcommittees. On behalf of all of my colleagues here, thank you for taking time to participate in this morning's meeting. It's nice to be able to be with you again, even if only virtually. Before we get started, I'd like to review just a couple of housekeeping items so that everyone knows how the meeting is going to proceed. I'll try to be quick. If you've been on other CSG Midwest calls, you've heard some of this before, and on other Zoom calls. But first of all, to let you know, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll post the recording later this week on within the next couple of days, I assume, on our csgmidwest.org website. You have all entered the meeting in a muted listen-only mode, and CSG staff will assist you and unmute your lines when you have questions or when you wish to participate in the discussion. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions and make comments after the presentations. So, please take advantage of this opportunity for engagement. Both, you'll be able to do that live when we unmute you, or also in the chat box. If you lose your connection to the meeting, here are a couple things you can do to try to reconnect. Just close Zoom and reconnect using the meeting link that was sent to you earlier this morning by email. If that doesn't work, reboot your computer or device and then try to reconnect with the link. And then finally, if you're unable to reestablish connection, you can call in and use this number. It's 312-626-6799 and participate by phone. These tips also appear in writing in the final pre-meeting message that was emailed to you this morning. So please refer to that message for assistance as needed. If we experience a major technical difficulty on our end, we'll send out an email message and let you know with further instructions. This is a screenshot of the Zoom toolbar, which you can display by moving your cursor over the Zoom window. And that's where you can mute and unmute your audio, show and stop your webcam, view the participant list, and access the chat window. And that's where you can submit written questions as the meeting proceeds. We'll do our best to address all of your questions and comments through the chat window. And of course, if you raise your hand by unmuting you. And just to, I'm sorry, I'm sort of not with this here. There's the participant list, okay. The chat function, or the raising your hand, is also there. And if you want to speak, just click on the raise your hand icon to alert our staff that you would like to speak, and we will call on you and open your line when it's your turn to comment or ask a question. You can also access your audio and webcam controls down here on the participant pane. Now I'd like to turn things over to today's moderators and MLC Midwest Canada Trade Subcommittee co-chairs, Indiana Senator Karen Tallien and Ontario MPP Percy Hatfield, and they'll guide us through the rest of today's meeting. Thank you both for your leadership of the subcommittee. And Senator Tallien, I'll turn it over to you now.
All right, well, thanks, Eileen. I want to start by just welcoming everyone and thanking our presenters for all the work they've done leading up to today. Thanks and welcome to all the attendees for taking time out of your day to join us. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the co-chairs of this committee. Percy Hatfield is a member of the provincial parliament from Ontario. Michigan State Rep Mark Huizenga has been part of the planning for this meeting, but he's unable to join us since Michigan House was called into special session. So it took several years for the three countries that are party to this agreement, the US, Canada, and Mexico agreement, USMCA, to finally come to an agreement on the accord, and for the accord to then be approved by all three countries. It finally became effective just a few months ago on July 1st. During today's event, we're going to hear presentations by two experts on the economic and trade ties between Canada and the US. Their presentations will include a discussion of the current state of trade between Canada and US, and a look at US trade policy generally. And it also will include a number of the key provisions of the USMCA and how they differ from NAFTA. So what's the impact of the USMCA and on our industries in our regions? And following both presentations, we'll have time for questions and answers, as well as for a discussion. And so now I'll turn it over to Mr. Hatfield to please introduce our presenters.
There. Thank you, Senator Tallien.
You bet.
Edward or Ted Alden is a journalist, an author, and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He specializes in U.S. economic competitiveness, U.S. trade policy, and visa and immigration policy. Ted currently teaches in the College of Business and Economics at Western Washington University, where he was recently appointed the Ross Distinguished Visiting Professor. He has written widely for major newspapers, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and he's appeared on CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, Fox News, PBS NewsHour, and Bloomberg Surveillance. Prior to joining the council, Ted was the Washington bureau chief for the Financial Times. And joining Mr. Alden for today's presentation and discussion is Dan Utso. And Dan is an attorney with the Dickinson WRIGHT law firm, where he's an international trade lawyer. And he heads up the Canada-US practice group. During negotiations over the USMCA, Dan testified before the Office of the United States Trade Representative, the USTR, and the Parliament of Canada, and has published multiple USMCA training materials. You may recognize Dan because he has worked with CSG over the years, beginning when he was an officer at the Canadian Consulate General in Detroit. He has also served as managing director for the US-Canada Law Institute and was the co-faculty advisor for the Canada-United States Law Journal and the Case Western Reserve Journal of International Law. Thank you both very much for being with us today to lead us through this conversation. So Ted, the floor is yours for the next 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hatfield. Thanks, Senator Tallien. I've been having a few stability issues here, so if I get knocked out, I'm going to come back immediately on my iPad. I hope that doesn't happen. It's great to be here with Dan as well, and thank you very much to Eileen for the invitation. Hope the Canadians on the webinar today all had a happy Thanksgiving. My wife is Canadian, and we've kept up the tradition of having 2 Thanksgiving dinners every year, so absolutely nothing to complain about. I'm going to set a bit of the broader context here today, and I think Dan will focus more on the nuts and bolts of some of the impacts USMCA is likely to have on the region. I have been following these issues for longer than I really should admit. I got my start as a young trade reporter covering the original NAFTA negotiations back in the early 1990s. I want to talk about 3 topics today. First, the importance of the new USMCA framework in terms of future economic stability for North America. Secondly, how North America and your region in particular may benefit from the broader changes taking place in global trade. And then finally, I will talk just a little bit about the pandemic and the partial closure of the US-Canada border. So let's start with USMCA, or CUSMA as it's known in Canada, or TMEC, as it's known in Mexico, which is the Spanish language acronym for Treaty Among Mexico, the US, and Canada. I don't think it's entirely symbolic that we've gone from a single North American free trade agreement to one now with 3 different national names. Many of you can probably recite the statistics on the importance of US-Canada trade. Canada remains the largest export market for the United States, worth nearly $300 billion in exports in 2019. The US, of course, is by far the largest export market for Canada. Purchasing, the US bought about $320 billion worth of Canadian imports in 2019. That's 3/4 of all of Canada's exports. Those numbers are going to be smaller in 2020 due to the pandemic, but even the latest figures from August show a drop of just 10% from August 2019. So trade has held up reasonably well. Overall trade between the US and Canada has nearly tripled from the pre-NAFTA days, and many of the biggest components of the US-Canada trade relationship are concentrated in the Midwest, including vehicles and machinery and agricultural products. But you also know that despite these positive trade numbers, NAFTA was the most controversial trade agreement ever signed by the United States, and the second most controversial ever signed in Canada after the original US-Canada FTA, which was debated for a good number of years in the mid-'80s. Rightly or wrongly, and mostly wrongly in my view, but rightly or wrongly, NAFTA was blamed for many of the challenges that have faced the manufacturing sector in both countries. Donald Trump, when he came to the White House in 2016, he promised to rip up or renegotiate NAFTA. And for many months, it seemed possible and even likely that the United States was going to withdraw from the deal. He came quite close to it several times. That created enormous uncertainty for a host of industries that had built their supply chains on the assumption that NAFTA was a permanent feature of the North American trade relationship. There was, not surprisingly, a lot of pushback on the Trump administration from affected US industries, a well-organized lobby by the network of Canadian consulates down here, many other efforts to make sure the administration did not walk away from NAFTA. The result, and it was after some pretty bruising negotiations, these were some of the roughest trade negotiations I have ever witnessed, was the new USMCA. And it departs from NAFTA in some significant ways that we will be discussing today. But I would argue that the most significant accomplishment of USMCA is not the specific changes in the deal, but rather the fact that it has now put North American trade relations on the most solid footing that they have ever been on. I would go so far as to say that the 3 decades-long controversy over NAFTA is now a thing of the past. Why do I make that claim? Well, you look at the vote in Congress to pass the USMCA. It was approved in the US House of Representatives on December 19th on a 385 to 41 vote. I'll repeat that, 385 to 41. And in the Senate by a vote of 89 to 10. To put those numbers in context, the original NAFTA passed the House of Representatives on a 234 to 200 vote, with a majority of then President Bill Clinton's own party voting against the agreement. The 2005 House vote to enter into a similar deal with Central America and the Dominican Republic, known as the CAFTA-DR agreement, squeaked through the House on a 217 to 215 vote, with only 15 Democrats in favor of the deal. Just one other piece of context in this regard. There were 109 House votes in 2004 against the US trade deal with Australia. Heard that right, Australia. So if you look at the numbers, NAFTA is now officially less controversial than the trade deal with Australia, which is pretty extraordinary. Whatever one thinks of US Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer record, really interesting, he is now out publicly defending that record in a way he hasn't over the first 3.5 years he's been writing in my organization's magazine, Foreign Affairs, and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So if you want to know Bob's trade philosophy. It's now all out there for everyone to see. I personally think he made some big mistakes on the steel and aluminum tariffs, which I think have been harmful here and been harmful in North American relations with Europe. I think the U.S. has mishandled the China negotiation. But I give him credit for making good on one of his core promises, which was to bring bipartisanship back into U.S. trade policy after decades in which Republicans and Democrats have been deeply divided on the issue. He worked extremely closely with the House Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi, who the president clearly doesn't like very much, on pulling this deal together. And that's one of the reasons that the NAFTA, and we'll talk about this more, includes so many longstanding Democratic demands, like a weakening of the investment arbitration rules, stronger labor rights provisions in Mexico, tighter rules of origin. It was really a deal that was negotiated by the Trump administration in very close tandem with the House Democrats. This certainly made the negotiations challenging for both Canada and Mexico. But I would argue that at the end of the day, both held on to what really mattered for them in the deal. For example, the dispute settlement provisions on AD/CVD that are so important for Canada. And in exchange, what we now have is an agreement that is likely to be less controversial and more durable than the original NAFTA. It's going to bring an element of certainty at a time of absolutely enormous uncertainty in the global economy. This brings me to my second point, which is that the certainty of USMCA is potentially a huge competitive advantage in North America. I mean, if you look back over the sort of 10, 15 years following China's accession to the World Trade Organization, North America lost out to some extent. I mean, a lot of what had been coming from Mexico was substituted by imports from China. The center of gravity really shifted a bit away from North America to Asia. But what we're seeing right now, I won't go into a lot of detail, I've been writing about this a lot, but we are at the early stages of a decoupling between the world's two largest economies, the United States and China. The two have moved from a mostly cooperative economic relationship to a mostly competitive and even conflictual one. And this is going to continue regardless of whether Donald Trump or Joe Biden is the next president. This is hardwired now into both of the parties. The economic consequences that almost every multinational company now is assessing its position in China and how vulnerable it might be to further deterioration in the relationship. Tariffs have already driven up costs for many companies. We have tariffs on most Chinese imports now. In some sectors like semiconductors, U.S. export controls and other sanctions are making it all but impossible for U.S. firms to do business in China. We are at the early stages of what will likely be a huge reshuffling of global supply chains. It doesn't mean that companies are going to abandon the Chinese market. It's too big and too important. But they are looking for more secure locations to serve customers in the rest of the world. Security, resilience, reliability of supply have replaced, efficiency and just in time as the buzzwords of supply chain management. This is potentially a big opportunity for North America. I think we are going to see some significant reshoring to the United States and Canada, particularly in industries deemed critical. More, I suspect, will flow to Mexico, since Mexico is a more obvious lower wage alternative to China. But this would also benefit US and Canadian companies, since Mexican products use a much higher percentage of US Canadian content than do products that are coming in from China. I mean, Mexico's part of this North American supply chain, and you have a lot of parts going from the US and Canada into Mexico for final assembly, since final assembly tends to be the most labor-intensive part of many manufacturing products. North America, for these companies, has some real advantages, even over what we've been seeing so far, which is the movement of supply chains to places like Vietnam and Malaysia. A lot of companies have done that, but just this week, the United States is threatening tariffs on Vietnam, alleging that Vietnam is manipulating its currency. So a lot more certainty in North America than we have anywhere else in the world. We are particularly likely to see this reshoring in sectors that are now being deemed critical, such as semiconductors and other high technology goods and medical equipment. Again, there's little difference between the Biden and Trump platforms on this issue. The Midwest is very well placed in that regard. 4 of the 10 largest pharmaceutical and medical equipment companies are in the country, are in Illinois and Michigan and Indiana. Ontario has strong medical and technology sectors. I mean, Canada will have some issues with what happens with Buy America. Going forward, Biden is promising to double down on Buy America. I think that's going to be some tough negotiations about whether Canada gets exempted from that. But again, potentially real benefits for Ontario here. So just one final issue that I want to touch on briefly, and I'm happy to take questions on. We were chatting about this in the pre-call, is the continued border closure between the United States and Canada, or partial border closure, as a consequence of the coronavirus. I'm affiliated out here with the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington. We've been gathering a lot of data on the impacts of the shutdown. The good news is that with respect to trade, the border shutdown has been carried out with surprisingly little impact. The two governments have worked very closely to ensure that cross-border trade was deemed an essential activity, and trade is largely unimpeded. Out here on the West Coast, our truck volumes as of August were back to 95% of the August 2020 level, and that reduction, I think, is just you can explain it by the slight weakening of the economy compared to where we were a year ago, rather than to border difficulties. But with respect, of course, to cross-border travel, the picture is very different. Most crossings of the northern border are people coming across for short visits, shopping trips, visiting family and friends. Those non-essential trips are down by about 98%. And the economic impact here for northern tier states like we're all living in, and for the Canadian provinces that rely on American visitors, the economic impact is very significant. Tourism and travel are the hardest hit sectors in both Canada and the United States. If you look at Ontario, tourism employment in August was down 230,000 jobs compared to a year ago. That's about 1/3 of the total job numbers. That's not all American visitors, of course, but it's a big part of it. In the United States, we've seen the biggest declines in travel spending in the Midwest and Northeast states. Again, this is not all a US-Canada story, but it's a big part of it. So I've been working with colleagues out here, trying to talk to officials about engaging on a path for safe reopening of the border. We haven't seen a lot of progress, though the Canadian government made some encouraging tweaks last year. Anyway, I will stop there and turn it over to Dan, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Oh, thank you, Ted. And we're going to take questions at the end of the second presentation. So in the meantime, anyone, please continue to type your questions in the chat or raise your hand to speak with our group today. And now we'll move on to the second presentation of our meeting, Dan. So it's over to you, buddy.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our distinguished co-chair and to all of the members of the Trade Subcommittee. It's great to be back with you. I'm going to use a PowerPoint just so we all don't have to look at each other the whole time, but it's such a privilege to be back. In addition to joining the thanks for your most precious resource, your time, I'd be remiss if I didn't note that we've had the honor to work with so many of you and your governors and lieutenant governors and economic development agencies, as well as CSG, to handle this pandemic over the last 6 to 8 months. Our firm, Dickinson Wright, as some of you know, is a law firm that was founded in Detroit back in the 1870s. You can just see where we're located there, but our native home is the U.S. Midwest, including Columbus. That's Columbus right behind me. That's actually actual footage behind me today. That's not a screenshot. It's actually a beautiful fall day here. But going back, and we've had full service offices in Canada since the 1860s. It's actually a little bit older than our U.S. operations, and then throughout the U.S. Southeast and U.S. Southwest. But we have clients operating all over the world. And we created a COVID task force really at the end of November, early December. I want to be clear, we had no idea what was coming. But what we were working on was our clients that had operations overseas or that were relying on components from overseas. We were just putting out the fires of the day, making sure that factories stayed open, that our supply chains stayed robust, working with shipping. I'm a trade and transportation lawyer, so I do a lot with freight forwarders and ocean vessels. And then quickly in January, February, we started working with many of your states to get PPE from around the world. And Ted touched on this a bit because so many of our states were just thrust, and our provinces were thrust out into the world. And our poor procurement officers, people in our procurement agencies at the state level that are usually procuring, things for schools and roads and, road salt getting ready for winter. And I hear it's going to be a little wet because of La Nina here. So we're probably going to have need a little more road salt than usual in our part of the world. But all of a sudden they're thrown in the global market to find PPE, which I've never seen anything in demand like we saw. And these folks were heroes. I mean, a lot of mistakes were made. This was not international trade in Geneva and cocktail parties, et cetera. This was more like the Star Wars cantina in the sense of this was full of smugglers and hustlers, and we were doing everything we can to get that. And there was just so much work done, particularly by state legislators, because our procurement systems were not, particularly on the state side, were not set up for this situation. And many of you found workarounds and we were able to get things into your districts and ridings. And I can't thank you enough, but also nobody wants to hear this today, but there's so much more work to do. And many of you are going to be like our friends in Michigan right now, figuring out how to fill budget holes, how to deal with reopenings, and quite candidly, I'm on calls nonstop about how we're going to deal with the sustainable issue of PPE, which quite frankly is going to be a state and provincial issue on how do we never get into this situation again. And I'm on calls all day with hospital systems that never talked to each other before, trying to come up with solutions for this. And there's a bit coming from that, from what we've seen already, and what, and Ted talked a little bit about this during the pandemic, and how we play in both the global trading situation, because I think every governor, every elected official, every premier has said, we're never going to be in this situation again. And there's a lot of folks here in the Midwest. I'm originally from Youngstown, Warren, Ohio. I grew up working in a steel mill, and parts of the country that have been talking about trade for a long time. Many of you have heard me say in the past, where I grew up, NAFTA wasn't a four-letter word, but if you said the word NAFTA, you were going to hear a four-letter word come flying back at you, and that builds off of Ted's point and his very eloquent and expert presentation today. But a lot of folks in our part of the world are saying, we told you so. We told you there would be a time we were going to need something, and we couldn't get it. And I think a lot of the part of the world has woke up to that. And I think that's true when we start talking about steel and aluminum, and you can go down the line where people are going to say, we told you. And there's a great Canada-US angle for this. We right now are working with one of the largest producers of PPE is actually a Canadian company that's looking at states right now to expand their operation and to set up manufacturing there to ensure that hospital systems and state procurement agencies never get in this. But as Ted indicated, when we start putting things like Buy America or Buy State X, that's actually going to hurt that situation. So as I'll start and then I'll end here is what can state legislators do and provincial members of parliament, provincial parliament do to help create an environment that's going to allow us to address COVID, but also the broader, and take advantage of much of the broader trade trends that Ted indicated. Now, USMCA is a big part of this, and where are we in USMCA? As the senator said at the outset, USMCA came into effect on July 1. It seems like we've been talking about this for years now, and we have, but here it is. And I've actually described this, as have others, the period we're in now, the honeymoon. We were talking about in the pre-call about some weddings, some folks that, some of these relationships that we're seeing at the Canada-US border where people are getting married to solve some of the border crossing issues. I actually think where we are in USMCA isn't quite a honeymoon, it's a 2020 wedding. So many of us have friends and family that, we're planning to get married this year and have kind of put that off to the side, or at least the ceremony, the reception, the family gathering, and have just made it legal, right? They went down to the courthouse or they went to their pastor, rabbi, whatever their faith tradition is, and they've made it official, so they're married as of right now, and that's what we are in North America. We're married. USMCA is here, it's in effect, but we really haven't had the big celebration, and we're really not living maybe in a full married couple way, if you will. Why? Because US CBP and our Canada Border Services Agency and Mexico counterparts are not really enforcing the agreement, where this is basically the ramp-up period. It's in effect as long as companies show reasonable care and satisfactory progress. And you can see all those quotes that we've seen. This is just saying, from a good Midwest perspective, this is the no-jerk rule. As long as companies aren't being jerks about this, things are running relatively smoothly. The fear, of course, is that companies are just now delaying getting ready for USMCA. You know, we were busy all fall of this time last year going into March, and that seems like ancient history, right? We've all learned how relative time can be during COVID, but most companies kind of put off USMCA because they're working to keep the lights on right now. My guess in talking with, you know, my colleagues, trade, customs brokers, et cetera, that I would say anywhere between a third to half of the companies impacted by USMCA have actually come into compliance and are taking the steps forward. That still leaves a heck of a lot of companies that once the switch flips in January, we're going to start seeing some compliance. And there's a key piece here. One of the big differences in USMCA, CUSMA, TMEC, as Ted indicated, from its predecessor, NAFTA. NAFTA, there was something called a certificate of origin. So the way that it was designed, even in 1994, there were global supply chains, was that the OEMs, our large auto companies, our law firm incorporated Chrysler back in the 20s, now FCA, that they reach down to their suppliers and say, you tell us if you comply with NAFTA and give us this form, a NAFTA certificate of origin, and they go down the chain, and they go down the chain, and you get this pile of certificates of origin. Well, what happened over time, over the last 25 years, is people just started filling out the form without doing the test. And the NAFTA certificate of origin was like a security blanket. Everybody up the chain was like, hey, I got a certificate of origin, I'm in the good. But the reality was a lot of that was bad data. And that's why we saw over time where 62.5% of your North American made automobile was required by the NAFTA. In practice, it was about 44%. It's because things had changed, supply chains changed, but people didn't change their forms. What USMCA has done is said, we don't care what the form you use. It's all about the data. You have to go back and actually go do your analysis under USMCA to make sure that you comply and keep that data, certify that, and have it on record. So if we come knocking at your door, you can show us that you did the test. The fact is, this freaked companies out. In June and July, when companies heard there was no such thing as a NAFTA certificate of origin, they lost their minds because it was a security blanket. It was, hey, I have the form, show me the form. A lot of customs brokers, law firms, US CBP finally came out with a template form. They got sick of answering the question, but it was all about, we don't really care what the form of the data is. We want the data. Why? Because all of that data is being entered into the computers in the sky, and that allows us to target and see what's compliant and what's not. And so that's where companies right now really need to spend. Every company that was using NAFTA will need to tweak what they're doing, every single company. Just because you were good under NAFTA doesn't mean you're good under USMCA. Many, many companies will need to transform what they're doing just in terms of their internal processes, and some, and particularly in the automotive advanced manufacturing sector, will need to completely transform what they're doing. We've compiled a checklist. I just put this here for your record, but one of the things that we're telling companies is just go back, show us how you were using NAFTA. Let's look at your purchase orders. But this isn't just about customs. There are changes to intellectual property. This is a great time to look at your transportation contracts and use this time to go back and check out your entire customs. The world has changed in the last 3 or 4 years. And right now, my first thing is when I go to a company and say, can I see your customs compliance manual? Most companies don't have them. That's the first thing U.S. Customs asks for when they show up at the door. Or can you tell me who's in charge of customs in this company? For large companies, yes, they have that in-house. But for most, it's the people in purchasing, procurement. Customs is just one part of what they do. And can I see your org chart that has that? And most don't, right? And what US CBP does is when they come in and they do an audit or what's known as a verification, Keep in mind, Customs was part, and CBSA does the same thing. They were part of the Treasury Department. They were IRS kind of people. When they come into your facility to audit, they'll go, for example, to the lunchroom or use the restroom. And if somebody's in there, they'll say, hey, I'm looking for the Customs Department. Do you know who's in charge of that? And if that employee in your operation says, we don't know, that's a black mark. That's a check that says you haven't taught your people in the company what customs compliance is all about. So this is a good time. Now, many of you, just now drilling down in the remaining time that we have, and Eileen and others, I am mindful of the time here, but I want to talk to you a bit about working on this agreement over the past few years. Where are we seeing benefits to companies and where are we seeing challenges in a very specific way? And many of you know, I've used the example of a renovation because, as Ted said, President Trump came particularly to our part of the world threatening to rip up NAFTA, and that didn't happen. About 60% of the new USMCA CUSMA is about the same as NAFTA, or incorporates language from prior trade agreements or trade agreements that came after NAFTA, so we've modernized it. But that still leaves 40%. So people, particularly in the media, that call this a rebrand are wrong. It is not a rebrand of North America. As I said, every company needs to do something to get ready. And I just cringe every time I see rebrand because I know what my clients are doing, which is, I don't need to worry about this. That's just human nature, right? This is a renovation, and I've used this example now for several years, but in the past it was more like using the architecture and engineering plans. This is more now we broke ground. And so first, there's a whole bucket of this, that 60% that are fresh coats of paint, but that's where there's a lot of good news for companies. Then we've modernized, we've upgraded the fixtures and appliances, and of course, then we've knocked down some walls. And that's particularly true in the auto, labor, and textile sectors. And when you start knocking down walls, we all know, and a lot of people are, good luck finding a contractor in the Midwest right now, right? Everybody's doing home improvements these days because we're all home looking at, man, I should have fixed that years ago, right? But whenever you knock down walls, it always costs more, takes longer, and is more disruptive than you think. Now, Ted laid it out a little bit differently, and I agree 100%. There was a deal. Another way to look at this is the deal is the business community, in order to strike that bipartisan consensus, the business community, you got 1 and 2. You got your templates and your modernization. These are very pro-business chapters. But in return for that, you're going to get what we want in terms of rebalancing, which were often Democrat-related type ideas. So that's the balance that's been struck. And candidly, I view this as what we'll see in every trade agreement coming forward. In terms of the fresh coat of paint, there's a lot of updating. There's now a small and medium-sized enterprise chapter. My favorite story from the negotiations is very early on in Ottawa, I think it was the 3rd session, was we were coming, it was anti-corruption day. And everybody, the Canadians and Mexicans in the U.S. was like, we're going to hit Mexico hard on anti-corruption, on including that. Mexico came with their own proposal, which was actually stronger than anything the U.S. and Canada wanted. Like the Mexicans knew they were in the crosshairs on that one. And frankly, that was true throughout the agreement. The Mexicans were well prepared, as were the U.S. and Canada. That Mexico knew that this was about them in a lot of ways and came prepared. On a granular level, what are we seeing? The biggest gains that we are seeing are for companies in the chemical area, polymers, plastics, coatings, so paint companies, et cetera. Basically what we make here in the Midwest, lots of good news in USMCA. We've made it a lot easier for those goods to qualify. When it came to chemicals, natural gas, oil, plastics, you used to have to trace the molecule under USMCA, and that created huge compliance burdens for our companies. This has actually been streamlined. Similarly, sanitary phytosanitary, which is just a big way of saying health and safety in the ag sector. There wasn't much to do in terms of zeroing out tariffs outside of dairy and seasonal produce. And both of those we kind of punted a bit. On sanitary phytosanitary, what we did for the ag community is some of the health and safety standards. We basically said the US, Mexico, and Canada need to minimize those burdens and do complementary regulation across 3. We're going to see some disputes with Mexico right now, probably right out of the chute on those provisions. Mexico has taken its time on issuing health and safety licenses to some of US ag producers. That chapter is going to come right into the forefront. But when I say for chemicals and polymer companies, what is right here used to be spread over about 50 pages. So again, you used to have to trace the molecule. Now what we've done is that there's 8 separate tests. And you know, my favorite is the isomer separation rule. Like, who knows what that means? But the bottom line is people in the industry do. All this means we are going to let you bring the raw materials from anywhere around the world as long as you do the mixing in North America. Because when you do the mixing here, we know there's jobs here, there's taxes here, and then that goes down the line that usually goes down to the 50 to 100 employee plant that's then extruding that out and creating that plastic form that then goes into an auto part or other parts of manufacturing. This is the lesson, and this gets exactly back to what Ted was saying in change of supply chains. We have made it easier across the board to bring raw materials into North America. Nobody cares about the raw materials. Where the fight is in 2 areas. One is if the raw materials come attached to another product, so it's a semi-finished product. So if you're bringing that bearing from, we don't care if you bring the bearing from China because it's pretty cheap to make, or from overseas. But if you bring the bearing attached to another piece of aluminum that's now coming into Windsor, that's going to go into a car part that's going to go back into the U.S., if your business model's on that, USMCA is going to affect you dramatically, because we are making it very hard to bring semi-finished products over here. And the debate between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico is where are we drawing the line at semi-finished and not. And that's also true in the discussions around the TPP, CPTPP. Which was CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was all about making it easier for procurement people to go out and find semi-finished products within that 12-country market. The U.S. just didn't have faith that Chinese stuff wasn't going to go into Vietnam and through the back door, and then that all of a sudden that semi-finished product is not really Vietnamese, it's Chinese. But that's what the fight's all about. At the end of the day, it's about that semi-finished. And then at the other end of the spectrum is on the next technologies. For example, electric vehicles. I spend most of my life, I say this not chest pounding, we probably know more about the electric vehicle rules in USMCA than anybody because we represent all those guys. And they're very complicated rules. They've made it very hard because in the electric vehicle for a lithium-ion battery, all of the cells are made overseas. We don't make lithium-ion cells. Those cells become a module, a group of modules becomes a pack. And so what they've said now is no. You can't make the cells overseas anymore. You want that to be USMCA, you got to do all of that production here in the United States, and there's a bit of a ramp-up period for that. But that gets to this issue of where we are right now in terms of supply chains and decoupling from China. What the U.S. is saying is, we know that those raw materials aren't going to be made in the U.S. and Canada. Frankly, as policymakers, you don't want that work done here. Those are jobs that can be overtaken at any time. You want the semi-finished to finished product jobs. But what we don't want are those raw materials coming from China. And so what we do is we want those raw materials coming from Mexico, and we want them coming from Vietnam or elsewhere, because we have more leverage with that. So USMCA fits in along with the China tariffs, that we're going to try to move that production. So right now, if you read any article about President Trump's trade war, it will say the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, all the U.S. companies in Shanghai have said they are not moving production. 70% of those companies have said they are not moving out of China. Well, no kidding. All of my companies in China aren't there to sell back to the U.S. They're there to sell to the Chinese market. There's 1 billion people over there, right? And selling to India and selling to the rest of Asia. There's more people that live in that part of the world than the rest of the world combined, right? They're not selling back. What you need to do if you really want to get a check on how it's working, and Ted touched on this, is canvass all the purchasing officers in Windsor and Kansas and Iowa, et cetera, and say, where are you buying stuff from now? And I guarantee you 70% of them will say, we're getting out of China, right? We're looking at Vietnam, we're looking at Mexico, we're looking at other places, we're looking at Malaysia as another hot one. Because we know there's too much uncertainty over there. We need to be able to source from those countries, bring it here, and do that production here in the Midwest. Now, very quickly, and I'll just wrap up over the next several minutes here, is in that middle section where there's a lot of good news for companies as on digital trade. So further to Ted's point, North America right now is the best part of the world in which to do digital trade, technology trade. It's actually, we took the provisions of the TPP and added in some local content, and right now that's good. Unfortunately, that's not going to prevent things like digital service taxes, Well, I think a digital service tax, which is the Amazon tax, the Google tax, Facebook tax, which Canada has talked about and has kind of parked for a little bit, and Britain, and if there's a discussion at the OECD and elsewhere, I think there's going to be a question whether it violates USMCA or not. We'll probably be duking that one out. Customs and trade facilitation, this is the border chapter. So all the work, CSG, that Eileen has probably heard more about the border and her life since September 11th than any human being on the planet. CSG has done so much work. State legislators, provincial members of provincial parliament have done so much work. All of that homework, 15 years, has been incorporated into USMCA, and we've now expanded it to Mexico. And at the end of the day, it's all about digital technology at the border as well. I did borrow these from Bill Anderson at the University of Windsor. Ted mentioned the Border Policy Research Institute. If you want anything to know anything that's going on in the Pacific Northwest, talk to BPRI, Western Washington, Lori Troutman, Ted and the gang. In the Midwest, it's Bill Anderson at the Cross Border Institute and Marta Anderson, no relation, at the University of Windsor. And then in terms of the Northeast, it's the University at Buffalo. Here's data, confirms exactly what Ted said. Truck traffic in April across the Midwestern bridges, June, August. We're basically back to where we were, showing that we've got trade right. Car traffic is a disaster. We really need to do something on travel and tourism right now. The Midwest is getting hit particularly hard. And it's time for the U.S. and Canada to get together and have a discussion about how we're going to reopen this border. It needs to happen soon. And we don't need to know the date. What we need to know is that somebody's having these conversations and trying to look at this from a risk management approach. We shut the border down, we had to do it, but now it's time to figure out how we're going to reopen in the same way that we did in crises past, like 9/11. Just lastly, knocking down the walls, which I often call the Michael Corleone chapter. Well, first we were dealing with China, secondly Mexico, and lastly the Michael Corleone chapter, because we settled all of the family's business in North America. So any dispute that Canada, the U.S., and Mexico had, we went after. I've talked a lot about China, the China piece. Okay, that's it through tightening rules of origin. Where USMCA, the big one we're going to see is on labor. In my view, the only time we're going to be talking about USMCA in the next 3 to 5 years is about labor issues in Mexico. There's two pieces to that. The main one is Mexico changed its domestic labor law in late 2017. It basically sat there after that. It was a constitutional amendment, and it basically sat under the last administration. Both the Andrés Manuel López Obrador administration and USTR and Democrats said, you're going to implement that provision. And what it basically is unionization in Mexico. Mexico has always had unions, but they're akin to company unions in the 20s and 30s on a realistic basis. And so what Chapter 23 does is it incorporates a lot of the domestic Mexico laws. Let me just be blunt here. AFL-CIO purportedly has about 600 organizers going to facilities in Mexico. The only reason they're not there right now is because of COVID. And so we will see rapid attempts to unionize U.S. and Canadian facilities in Mexico. Right now, there are surveys that the Mexico Chamber of Commerce has put together. All of our companies are receiving surveys from, for example, pick your big auto company or sending it out to their suppliers and asking people to kind of fill out a checklist. It's about 50 questions. Do you support labor rights? Do you have elections? The problem is it's going to like the purchasing people, and it has very legal, intense questions. They say they're confidential. There's nothing confidential. There's no privilege. So you're going to have people filling out these forms, basically telling what they're doing. And when these investigations and certification processes start, this is where the focus is going to be. The question I think we have, and Ted touched on this, while there may not be a debate in Congress over whether USMCA was good or bad in the same way that it was over NAFTA, the question is whether, if we get into a Biden administration, whether they'll actually enforce USMCA, whether USMCA will even be on the radar, right? Or will there be more of a focus on domestic issues, right? And I think you're going to see a strong push by labor unions to make sure that this happens. And you can see the sectors there that are really targeted. Basically everything we do in Mexico is on the implementing bill. Textiles, I'll just quickly end here and say textiles, major changes. Companies that are in the textile world know that this is a tricky issue, but it's just a big issue. And last but not least, autos. Autos, we did 4 things. We increased regional value content from 62.5 to 75. We've defined what parts are, labor value content, and originating purchases of steel and aluminum. All this means is right now, your formerly North American car went from 62 to 75% over the next several years. How do you get there? Most convoluted slide ever made, but the bottom line is we've basically taken a car apart, looked at every component, and said, you have to tell us if it's a core part. If it's the big stuff, it's got to be 75% made in North America, and prove that to us. If it's a principal part, 70%, and 65%, excuse me, for everything else. And when you're doing that, at the end of the day, the OEMs need to certify that 40% of the vehicle for light vehicles and fast vehicles and light trucks, and 45% for heavy vehicles was made with $16 an hour or higher. And the only places that do that, at least up until very recently, were the US and Canada. What does that mean? It doesn't mean the minimum wage in Canada and Mexico is now $16 an hour. What it means is when I'm sitting there as the purchasing guy or woman or it, there, she, it, whatever, at the Ren Center in Detroit at GM, I know that my next model of car has to have 40% of that vehicle needs to be made with $16 an hour or more. So I may need to use the tooling guy in Windsor, or I may need to go over to Alberta to find some of the energy aspects, some of the vehicles from there, or Ohio, Michigan, et cetera, and I can't source that from Mexico anymore, and certainly can't source it from overseas. So what this did in theory, it's a bit of a myth that the big assembly plants in Mexico are going to come back to the US or Canada. That ain't happening. But what's going to happen is the rest of the supply chain that was following that is going to be held neutral. It's going to stay where it is, theoretically, so that companies can meet these thresholds. And then as we release the new types of vehicles, electric vehicles, et cetera, that production will be done, as we saw Ford just announced in Canada and Oakville, as General Motors announced in Lordstown, both of which were facilities that had closed over recent years, that those new technology investments will be made in North America. Now, nobody knows if this is going to work, right? No, I mean, the jury is still out, but that's the end game. And I'll just end there. There's several more slides on certification, but I talked about how companies certify at the beginning, but just in the interest of time and wanting to get to your questions, that's where we are, other than to say, what can state legislators do? And in my opinion, and I am exactly on side with where Ted is, we are in a period of significant disruption in supply chains. All of our supply chains that were just in time, that were starting to move to just in case after Fukushima and Japan, right now are saying we need to transition what we're doing. We need to look for markets where we know we're going to plunk a 5 to 7 year investment in a new facility and millions of dollars and find the workforce and all of those types of things. Where can we do it? What states and provinces should be doing is really looking at how do you create an environment that shows you're the most stable place for that investment. And all of our economic development, I spend more time with your state's economic development officials probably than anybody. I'm a glorified site selector in a lot of ways because we're always moving facilities and plants and those types of things. And workforce is always our number one issue, but right now the number two issue is, am I going to be able to invest in this state or province and still be able to access the US and Canadian market? Because a lot of our companies treat those as one market, and I can tell you that is certainly true for companies overseas. When companies overseas are looking at North America, they see one place. And so they're saying, if I plunk down in Indiana, am I going to have access to Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, et cetera, and vice versa? Or do I invest in Canada, take advantage of Canada's immigration system so I can address some of my workforce but still have access to the US market? And I know several provinces, particularly Ontario, have reached out to US states to create strategic investment partnership agreements, looking at things like procurement. What can we do on electric vehicle batteries? What can we do that? Because companies right now have enough issues to figure out. They don't have time to figure out, what does this state play nice with that one? with that province. What they need to look at, and when you look at what Vice President Biden could do if the election goes that way, there's going to be so much uncertainty on procurement, on Buy America type issues, that companies are going to want to know, if I'm a Canadian, if I invest in Canada to take advantage of workforce, am I going to be able to still sell my stuff to a U.S. state that state has a contract? For example, that a bus company, that a state that's buying buses, that's going to use electric vehicle technology that I'm creating in Canada, and will I be able to sell that into the U.S. to the manufacturer in the U.S. that's getting money from a Buy America grant? Those things need to be worked out, and if you can create a turnkey solution for that, you're going to end up with more companies in your state. And so I'll end there, or a province, and I'll end there and turn it back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dan. Very informative. Thank you very much. Now we're going to go to the questions and the discussion. So you can either ask your questions through the chat function or raise your hand. If you raise your hand and you're called on, we will unmute your microphone. So I'm going to turn it over to Mitch. Mitch, over to you, buddy.
Thank you, Mr. Hatfield, and thank you for those presentations, Dan and Ted. If you would like to see some of the slides that we went through a little quickly, they are currently in your chat. You could download a PDF of those slides. The first question we have comes from Senator Tom Hawk in Kansas. He asks, what is the impact on dairy farmers and industry of the USMCA, and what adjustments have and will be made?
I can take a first cut at it if you want, and Dan, I'm sure, has some more details. But there was a slight opening of the dairy market in Canada under USMCA. It had been a long-standing demand from the United States, particularly important in Wisconsin. Already, the issue is on the verge, I think, of being litigated in some way between the two countries. U.S. dairy farmers have been complaining that the way Canada is implementing the arrangement, and do not ask me to explain all the complexities of it, the dairy arrangements are mind-numbingly complex in terms of the different categories of products. But already U.S. dairy farmers have been writing to USTR Lighthizer and saying that the agreement is not being implemented faithfully. So I think that's going to be one of the first out-of-the-box disputes under the new USMCA. I mean, more broadly, the issue for dairy right now is the impact of COVID and the downturn. The loss of school milk programs and things like that, with schools being shut, and dairy farmers have really been hit hard. The government U.S. government's been offering a lot of aid to U.S. farmers, partly as compensation for the damage done in China in the tariff war with China. I think that money will continue, but obviously for a lot of dairy farmers, it's far from making them whole yet.
Yeah, I would just add, this is Dan again, I was in this fight, so I want to be a little bit careful during the negotiations on behalf of dairy farmers. But what I will say is Canada, as Ted said, has increased marginally the amount, but it will have an impact, there's no question. And the one issue for Canada that I don't think the U.S. fully appreciated during the negotiations was Canada had also agreed to allow more dairy access as part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal. So in a very short period of time, those two, when you add those two together, it becomes a significant number to the Canada-based dairy farmers. The big issue for the U.S. was actually when Canada would overproduce certain products, and Class 7 being one of them, which was eliminated, but then putting that out into the open market, allegedly, particularly to go around the world. So Canada would produce certain products, or the runoff from certain products, if you will, would then go out into the world market, particularly powders. And that became, and then that has an issue of now kind of subsidized dairy products, allegedly, now going out into global markets. The U.S. actually got a big win there in terms of being able to somewhat manage the way Canada, or at least have a say-so in how Canada is going to export dairy around the world. And I think that was a big issue for the Dairy Association. So it's market access, but it's also how it's going to be governed. And I think we're all going to have to wait and see how that works out. I will just say that there was a missed opportunity, though, because as was indicated, our U.S. dairy farmers are in big trouble, are hurting right now for a lot of reasons. And there was starting to be some uptake in upstate New York and in Wisconsin and elsewhere saying maybe Canada's got a solution to dairy issues. I know it's very controversial in Canada, but maybe we can learn something from each other and have our dairy industry actually work cooperatively. And my hope is that we can kind of get back to those discussions of how do we, instead of having competing industries, maybe take some of the best practices, not just technology, but actually how do we manage that supply going forward. And that may be an area, frankly, for this committee to take a look at in the future, because it's right now a competitive relationship, and it doesn't necessarily need to be, because the end users are on both sides of the border, as are some of the large processors. A dirty little secret is that one of the large processors in Wisconsin is also in Quebec, and they were fundamental in trying to broker a deal here when it came down to it. So I think this is actually an area where we can collaborate, but there's going to be a lot of noise about it over the next few months, I expect.
Great, thank you very much for those answers. This next question comes from Co-Chair Senator Karen Tallien, and she would just like to hear a little bit more about the effects of the USMCA on North American steel markets.
I'm happy if you want to launch this one again, and it actually kind of keys off Dan's point about cooperative relationships. One of the real shocks to Canada and Mexico about the Trump steel and aluminum tariffs was that Canada and Mexico were not exempted initially. The pattern under NAFTA has been for the United States to exempt NAFTA partners from these big safeguard actions, which is what the steel tariffs the steel and aluminum tariffs effectively were. I know they were done under a national security pretext, but effectively they were a kind of safeguard action. And so, the Canadians were pretty shocked that they got brought under this, and there was a very, very difficult negotiation. And now in USMCA, you have a truce of sorts. So there's nothing in the USMCA that prevents the United States, if it wishes to in the future, from putting tariffs back on steel and aluminum. The Trump administration threatened to do so against Canada on aluminum quite recently, but it does contain the dispute in some way. It stipulates the ways in which the Canadians and Mexicans can retaliate. It tries to keep the dispute a little bit bounded. I am hopeful, the fact that the Trump administration threatened to reimpose tariffs on Canadian aluminum, partly because we had seen significant growth again in Canadian imports. The fact that the Trump administration did not go forward with that gives me some hope that we're going to see a kind of new stability in those markets. I mean, both, steel to a considerable extent, aluminum a little less, both are in oversupply globally. So these are industries that are constantly struggling against lower price imports, falling prices globally. That has been the situation ever since I started paying attention to trade in the early 90s. And, I learned a lot of what I know from Alan Wolf, who's now the Deputy Director General of the WTO. He was working on this stuff back in the 70s. I mean, oversupply in steel has been a core problem in world trade for half a century now. USMCA, again, I think is going to bring a little greater stability in the North American context, but problems in steel and aluminum are not going away. They're just a kind of feature of global trade. At least have been ever since I started paying attention to it.
Yeah, I would add too, just I think that's spot on, but I think it's really important to remember that the U.S. position in 2017 going into 18 when they put the tariffs on was, it really, as Ted mentioned, the OECD Global Forum, G20 on overcapacity of steel, overproduction of steel, basically called the international community agreed that China's overproduction of steel was a plague. That's an exact quote. Now that was obviously before the times in which we're in, where that word was thrown around a little more freely, or maybe less so, I don't know. But I don't think there's any dispute in the world that there's too much steel coming out of China or other base metals. The U.S. position was, we've been dancing around this for too long. We're putting tariffs on, come along with us. And we're going to do some things in USMCA, because the reality is everybody has to put tariffs on to deal with China or other types of measures, or you have to put them on everybody if you go solo. And that's the problem with the U.S. approach to some extent. Was because it's like water. It's like water in your basement. It's going to find the lowest point and start over. When there's too much steel or base metals, they're going to find the lowest point and they're going to go in the market. So the big concern for the U.S. on steel and aluminum originally wasn't really Canadian-made steel, and it really wasn't Mexican-made. It was that steel and aluminum could come through the back door, transshipment, right? It could come into Canada. So if Canada didn't have tariffs on, or Mexico didn't have tariffs on, it would come through the back door, or import substitution. The Canadian Mexicans would buy the cheap Chinese steel and send its steel down to the U.S. and displace the U.S. market. Now, there was no evidence that was happening, by the way. So that was the problem with the U.S. approach, is if you're going to make those assertions on your allies, you better make sure that you have the evidence that there is transshipment. And I don't think the U.S. ever did. Where we've got to, I think, however, is that Canada, after we lifted the steel and aluminum tariffs in 2018, and before the most recent debate, actually put significant measures on in fall of 2019. I'm sorry, after we lifted in 2019. Put significant measures, and Canada has already had strong measures on steel and aluminum. So I think what we're seeing is we got here in a roundabout way, but the three-part, and Mexico just did it because it got scared by the aluminum tariffs. They put measures on. So we actually have North America actually somewhat unified in its approach to Chinese steel and aluminum. We just got here in a very terrible way, and arguably. And then, of course, within USMCA itself, as I indicated, 70% of the steel and aluminum, that is going to be in your automobile has to come from the region. And in a few years, that's actually going to have to be melted and poured in North America, meaning you can't bring the slab from Russia or China or anywhere else and then use it at a facility in Pennsylvania. You actually have to create the steel and bring all the raw materials in and create the steel. Now, whether the U.S. industry and Canadian industry is going to be able to keep punching through until that point. I mean, the market is so competitive. We're seeing U.S. Steel and others close down facilities right now, largely because of COVID right now. But we'll see how much longer we can keep punching. I'm a steel kid, as I said. It's going to be a street fight, at least. But fortunately, it's going to be a street fight against the rest of the world and not within the same block in North America.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Dan, for those answers. We'll just take one more question before finishing up today. You guys talked a little bit about just-in-time supply chains versus having those having supply chains ready and waiting. And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, I was wondering if obviously the USMCA was negotiated before this happened, but how does the new trade agreement affect supply chains of things like PPE? In your opinion, will that be easier to have emergency provisions and emergency supplies?
You okay, Dan, doing the same? Me and you, I don't mean to go first every time. Yeah.
No,
I mean, I think this is going to be one of the big debates in the next couple of years. If you look at Vice President Biden's platform, for example, his Build Back Better platform, and he set it out on the campaign trail. He's calling for 100% of PPE sourced by the U.S. government to be made in the United States. He's basically saying we should never be dependent on the rest of the world for these critical supplies. I hope in the North American context he gets talked out of that. I mean, the Canadians were on the receiving end of this with I'm not going to remember the details exactly. Maybe Dan can fill in. But with some of the masks, the U.S. threatened to block 3M from exporting masks to Canada, and the Canadians pointed out that the fiber used in the 3M masks was coming from Vancouver Island, and if we weren't going to sell them masks, maybe they wouldn't want to sell us fiber for the mask. These are very integrated markets, and we learned a couple of things from COVID. I mean, one was we do need greater levels of self-reliance in a lot of these areas to be able to deal with an unexpected pandemic like we're dealing with right now. But the other thing we learned is you have these kind of rolling shutdowns. Different parts of the country, different parts of the world are locked down at different times depending on the progress of the pandemic. And we can imagine a future pandemic that hits the United States very hard, doesn't hit Mexico and Canada as hard. And if we've shut down our production facilities in order to try to stop the spread of the virus, we're going to want to have access to production from other places. I mean, my colleague Tom Boyke at CFR has been writing a lot about this, Chad Bown at the Peterson Institute. Self-sufficiency really isn't the way to go in a lot of these areas. You need a robust and resilient supply chain. In a lot of cases, you might want to bring it closer. So you might want to have a North American supply chain rather than being, say, so dependent on China for pharmaceutical precursors like we are right now. But I hope in the US we don't go down the road of thinking, look, we got to have all this stuff inside the 50 states, because that I actually think will make us less secure and less resilient than a more diversified supply chain that involves certainly our regional neighbors and also reliable suppliers in other parts of the world. Europeans are having the same conversation, and they're moving a little less down the we got to make it all ourselves road and talking more about having resilient supply chains that involve more than just European production.
Yeah, and I think we started off, I mean, that's a great point. We actually started off, I was excited at first, I mean, in the middle of a tragedy as much as you could be, because we started off, what you immediately saw was FDA and Health Canada start doing mutual recognition of each other's products in terms of moving hand sanitizer and other types of products. And so because we had to fill immediate needs, and a lot of that homework had been done in the Canada-U.S. Regulatory Cooperation Council, which also has come into the USMCA. And so there was some hope. And then we had the 3M issue. And then we basically started to do exactly what we did after 9/11, which each country started designing its own approach in Canada and the U.S. to how we were going to handle this. And then the hope is that at some point in the future they would converge. And I think where I would encourage this committee, subcommittee, and CSG generally, is to start thinking about exactly what Ted just said. Like Ohio, we're not going to solve this by ourselves. We're just not. But if we can have a supply chain that looks at and treats Canada as one supply chain and deal with Buy American issues and set up an agreement where we'll have reciprocity on that, that can work. That can actually solve this problem a lot faster, because we had certain supply in Canada that we were able to bring down. We had certain supply in the U.S., and also we've had a lot of these private sector initiatives. One solution that I see, look, it is not going to be economical for every state to have, or even FEMA for that matter, to have huge stockpiles of ventilators and gloves and masks that are just going to get old, which is exactly what happened after H1N1. Is they get old, they get musty, attention turns, and people forget. What you need to do is say, when we need to ramp up, when there is a crisis like this, where can we pull from the U.S.? Where can we pull from Canada? Which facilities can ramp up? Can we get Mary Kay or Bath & Body Works making hand sanitizer? And have that kind of mobilization plan in place and treat that. And we're already doing that in Canada, U.S. We do it with fire management. There's something like, for example, the CREMAX, the Central Region Emergency Management Agencies. And there's a plan between states and provinces when there's a disaster. What do we do? And fire is the best example. Flooding is another example. We should be doing the same thing on pandemic response. Is who's really good? Because I know some of the auto manufacturers, APMA was a leader in Canada to get some face mask production. We did a lot in Detroit, Ohio, places like that. There were a lot of things coming out of Kansas and Iowa as well. How can we create one strategy around that together? But that takes folks to want to talk to each other, because as Ted said, I didn't hear one governor or premier fail to say, we want to make this in our backyard. Every single one of them said that. That's the lesson learned. But you also can't do that. The reality is you can't do it economically, and I don't even think you can do it tactically and getting the pieces. So come up with one strategy, and that homework needs to start right now.
Just before I turn it back to Eileen to wrap it up, I wonder if Ted and Dan, you could give me a 30-second answer to this one. Ontario's Parliament this week passed a private member's motion not to stop going into daylight savings time if New York and Quebec followed suit. I had to remind them that Michigan was also a key player. But how far afield would we have to go because of trade and just-in-time delivery and so on if indeed we were eventually going to get away from daylight savings time.
Dan, if you've thought about this one, go.
Yeah, I don't think it's really a trade issue. I know like Scott Linacomian and those guys, they hate, the libertarian guys at the Cato Institute hate daylight savings time. It's just like an affront to regulation. I don't think trade figures out time zones. We figure that out. Although I still never know where I am in Indiana. I defer to our good friend, the senator there, and others on the line. You're in certain parts of Indiana, you're in one place or the other. I just rely on my phone to tell me where I am, but from a trade side, I don't think we need to go too far afield. We can figure that out. We just need to know what the rules are when people do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I would just comment more as a parent than as a trade guy. I mean, I remember sending my kids off to school in the dark before the switch back, and I do think some of this is an overreaction to our current situation, in which we're kind of imagining our kids are going to, be online for school. A lot of the time we're all going to be working out of home, and therefore why not save more evening time? But I think, the switch is there for a reason, right? So we don't have, young people in particular heading off in the pitch black in the morning. So I don't really quite get the logic behind the switch, but.
Okay, well, now we're going to switch back to Eileen to wrap us up then. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank, first of all, our presenters, Ted Alden and Dan Utso, for sharing their wealth and depth of knowledge on trade issues with the Trade Subcommittee and others who were participating in this webinar this morning. So thank you both very much. Thanks also to our committee co-chairs, Senator Talion and MPP Hatfield, for your time and leadership, and in absentia to Representative Huizenga as well, who, as Senator Talion mentioned, was involved in the planning, but got pulled into special session today. And finally, thanks to all of you who participated in this virtual meeting today. We know your time is valuable. We very much appreciate that you were with us. So thank you all, and stay safe.
Thanks, Eileen, for a great
Thanks,
job. Well done once again.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.